Judgment in the appeal, Lord Advocate representing the Taiwanese judicial authorities Mother and Dean.
Lord Hodge will explain the judgment of the court.
Mr. Dean is a citizen of the United Kingdom who lived for 19 years in Taiwan before he was involved in a road traffic accident in which a man was killed. Mr. Dean was convicted of driving under the influence of alcohol, negligent manslaughter, and leaving the scene of the accident. He was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. While his appeal was pending, he fled Taiwan and came to Scotland. The Taiwanese judicial authorities applied for his extradition. Mr. Dean was detained in prison in Scotland for almost 3 years, pending his extradition. Sheriff McKeever decided that his extradition to Taiwan would not breach his rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. Mr. Dean appealed that decision to the Appeal Court of the High Court of Justiciary in Scotland on the ground that prison conditions in Taiwan would breach his right under Article 3 of the Convention not to be subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. The Appeal Court of the High Court of Justiciary, with Lord Drummond Young dissenting, held that even if the extensive assurances which the Taiwanese authorities had given were honoured in their entirety, there was still a real risk of ill treatment, and that accordingly Mr. Dean's extradition to serve the remainder of his prison sentence was not compatible with Article 3 of the Convention. The Lord Advocate, representing the Taiwanese judicial authorities, appeals to this court. Mr. Dean challenges the jurisdiction of this court to hear the appeal, arguing that the appeal does not raise a devolution issue, which alone would confer jurisdiction on this court on a question of this nature. He also raises arguments under Articles 5 and 8 of the Convention concerning the lawfulness of his detention and the interference which it involves with his private life and his family life. In a unanimous judgment, this court holds that the appeal is competent, allows the Lord Advocate's appeal, and rejects Mr. Dean's further challenges under Articles 5 and 8 of the Convention. First, in relation to the challenge to jurisdiction, this court holds that the question under the Extradition Act 2003, whether the acts of the Scottish Government in seeking to extradite Mr. Dean are compatible with his convention rights, is a devolution issue. The Appeal Court of the High Court of Justiciary decided a devolution issue, and therefore this court has jurisdiction. Secondly, in his appeal, the Lord Advocate intimated that he had changed his position from that which was argued on his behalf before the Appeal Court. That court, he asserted, had applied the wrong test on the urging of both parties. Where the threat to an individual comes from non-state actors, the correct test is to ask whether the state is to provide reasonable protection against harm. This court agrees and considers that one must assess first whether the Taiwanese authorities are undertaking to provide Mr. Dean with reasonable protection against violence from third parties, in particular other prisoners, while he is in prison. And secondly, if they are, whether the conditions in which he will be detained in order to give him such protection would infringe Article 3. The court holds that there is no evidence that the Taiwanese authorities would not give him reasonable protection in accordance with their undertakings, and also that if, to avoid such violence, he elected to stay in his cell, which he would share with another non-violent foreign prisoner, and to exercise out of doors by himself, that relative isolation would not amount to a real risk of treatment, which would infringe Article 3. The court also holds that Mr. Dean's challenges under Articles 5 and 8 of the Convention are without substance. In relation to the lawfulness of his detention under Article 5, his complaint is that while the Taiwanese authorities have undertaken to give him credit towards the completion of his prison sentence for the time that he spent in prison in Scotland, they will give him no credit towards his parole for that time. They require him to serve 2/3 of the remainder of his sentence before he is eligible for parole. This court holds that there is nothing arbitrary about his detention because he is unable to claim credit towards his parole for the time that he spent in prison in Scotland. That is simply the result of his flight from justice in Taiwan. In relation to the Article 8 challenge, the interference with his private and family life, which his extradition and his imprisonment would entail, that interference is justified as it is necessary to prevent crime and to protect the rights and freedoms of others. This court remits the case back to the appeal court in Edinburgh to determine his appeal against the extradition order itself, which the appeal court has yet to address.
Thank you for coming. The court is now adjourned.